Well, welcome back again. This is the newest edition of America at 250, A History, the podcast. And we have all three of us here today. Joanne Freeman is back with us. Beverly Gage is on my right. And we're going to talk about Bev's wonderful, I think, tour de force lectures that the last week or so, particularly her last two lectures on the progressive era and now the New Deal. We're moving fast. But the reading for this week, Beverly, is the famous Walter Lippmann, his book on public opinion, founder of the New Republic, major writer, voice of kind of liberal America in that era. But in a remarkable book that I honestly had never read, which is all about mass media, the irrationality of human nature, our susceptibility to influence.
The realities of democracy.
The realities of democracy and words, how words are used and misused, stereotypes, and much, much more. But we'd like to hear more about the book from you. You chose to use it. It does fit this era, this explosion of new forms of technology and communication quite beautifully. There's a lot that he anticipates that's to come and much that he can't anticipate. But tell us why you chose Walter Lippmann's book.
Walter Lippmann wrote this book in 1922, and he's still a very young man when he writes this. So he's this fascinating figure if you're interested in political ideas in the 20th century, because he gets started very young and he's very ambitious. And when he's in his mid-20s, he just starts spouting his own political views. And he continues to do that basically until the day he dies. And many things happen along the way, and he changes his ideas over time. But so I thought this book was interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that it is a young man, a smart young man, trying to look out at this rapidly changing world and make sense of it. And he's trying to make sense of a few different things. So one is the legacy of the progressive era and the kinds of economic conflicts and high hopes and ambitions that had been part of the progressive politics. That's where he came of age politically, founding the New Republic. But things are starting to look not so promising by the 20s on that front.
They've had a big world war, too.
Then he's looking at the First World War, which is this cataclysm that came almost out of nowhere for a lot of people and became a war that killed millions, in which the United States made this bid to get involved at the end of the war and then produced all sorts of difficulties and social dislocations. And then he is looking ahead and thinking, maybe these questions that we've been asking are the wrong questions. And the thing that's really going to matter going forward are all these new forms of communication that are coming into being. And he sort of says at the beginning of the book, why hasn't anyone been writing about this? Why are there no books about journalism? Why are there no books about public opinion?
There's the passage that says, you would think, given how significant this is, that there would be a vast number of books about this. And yet there are not, which is a really good question, right? Because now looking back, public opinion is at the heart, the fact that we know what it is, that we are sophisticated in manipulating it, that we've come, in a way, he was looking towards the future. Looking back, we can understand that basically to survive in this world in one way or another, you need to be thinking about your impact or the impact of what you're doing on public opinion, particularly gets back to technology, right? Technology is where you say something and in a nanosecond, it gets like projected around the world because of people with phones, and projecting things all over the place. So
Right, but they were dealing with a variation on that.
Yeah.
So those
Exactly.
opening images
Yeah.
that he comes up with, right, there are a couple of different challenges that seem to be on the horizon. So one is wartime propaganda. World War I, for all of the governments involved, including the United States, produced this incredible outpouring of official government propaganda that was supposed to mobilize the masses. And it did that somewhat effectively in some cases, but it also in the United States led to all sorts of conflicts, vigilante violence, and kind of a punitive, frightening, aggressive mob spirit that is a big problem as
And all but
someone
the
like
destruction of free speech.
exactly
For a while.
Exactly. And so Lippmann is worrying about wartime propaganda, speech restrictions, all the things that have come out of that. Then he's also really thinking about, and this is the opening image of the book, he's really thinking about, well, look, if we here in the United States are going to need to know things about what's going on in places really far away. Yeah. So that's the war itself. And then all of this kind of post-war planning where you're getting commissions together and they're like, let's divide up the globe and let's do this to these people and you get this land and you get this land and this movement gets rewarded. And you can see Lippmann, who was there at Versailles with Wilson, thinking, how do people actually, know what they are talking about, and do they at all? Suddenly you're supposed to have opinions about all these places and all these situations, and he's asking how you do that. And then there are these new technologies that are starting to come in, which make these flows even more rapid.
And as a progressive, or he cut his teeth as a progressive, he's deeply worried about this thing called democracy. They had fought a war to save democracy and to end all war, but it clearly wasn't. Conflict, violence breaks out like crazy right after the war here at home. And so he's worried about that too. I mean,
they're linked, right? Because
Yeah.
I can't remember whether I've already said this in a previous episode. So, folks, if I have, forgive me. But it's about
they
technology.
won't remember.
That's hey.
Sorry.
But
We all
it's about
forget every
technology.
day.
It's about technology and democracy, and that is just if you conceive of politics as a conversation between the person who is given power and the people who give the power.
Right.
So it's a conversation of sorts. So any technology that shapes that conversation shapes democracy. And in a way, that's part of what's at the heart of this, is he's seeing all of these technologies and he's seeing the ways in which they're shaping conceptions and assumptions and the kinds of knowledge that are out in the world. I mean, he's right? That's vast. But it's fascinating to see him confronting that. And you mentioned about, being there with Wilson and how are people getting the information. The part of that to me that I find most striking in the book, and he talks about it several times, is how exhausting it is to try and get all the information and think about all the information. There's a sort of tone of that in which you can sense him in the mix of this, sort of realizing, wow, like this is a quandary.
Right, and this is one of the premises of the book, that in a complicated modern society, and a modern society where people are moving around faster, getting more information, supposed to have opinions about all sorts of things that, when you just sat around in your own town and didn't go anywhere and got one publication every month, that was a whole different scene. But the modern world is moving fast and creating all of these challenges of information and decision-making and all of that. And he's deeply concerned with this. And he's trying to figure out a way to get good information. And he's looking back, right? One of the nice things about this book, he's looking back to de Tocqueville and Jefferson and Lincoln. And he's just
it's like a greatest hits of our course.
Funny that it got assigned that way.
I know.
Interesting.
Gee.
But he is also...
That wasn't an accident, was it?
He's also... the funniest thing to me about this book, and you talk about technologies as like information technologies, but there are these technologies of government that are coming into being, right? Expertise, administrative bureaus, the bipartisan state. And the funniest thing to me about this book is that he's like, well, there are all these problems and everything, but how we're going to solve it if you get to the end. We're going to create this Bureau of Experts.
Yes.
I know.
This Bureau of Experts
The right
who are going to
commission
tell
can
you
solve any
what's
problem.
true.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to worry about it because they'll figure it out and they'll give you the good information.
Totally.
And it's such a dream. And it's so popular in this moment. And yet, as we are seeing in our own politics, it's come under challenge and all
What's
of that.
fascinating about that is, or at least my experience of reading this, is I'm reading along and I'm like, like really interesting idea. And then you get to that and I was like, oh, come on now. What it reminded
That's
me.
because of our experience.
Well, what it reminded me of was actually Thomas Paine, Common Sense. Because he's talking about theory and ideas and why monarchy is a bad idea. And then suddenly he decides, like, here's what government should look like.
You go,
and
what?
I know, John Adams did, right? John Adams is like, well, you know, it's going along pretty well. And then like, what? Like, huh? So it felt very much the same, and that someone coming up with really interesting, innovative ideas that are looking ahead and that are experimental. But there's one thing to be ideological in that sense, and it's another thing to apply that to practical purpose. And this book kind of like shows that in literally black and white.
Isn't there also a sense in which, if they wanted to, everyone could read this book and find something? Marketing in the boom of the 1920s. He's writing about that. He's anticipating. How do you make a consensus? How do you get people fascinated with a product? How do you manage a political argument? I mean, political operators must have seized on this set of ideas here.
How do you create a stereotype that will be useful to you?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Right. There are two terms that people often point to as coming out of this book, at least in some general way. So one is that idea of the stereotype, which in our own world has a kind of pernicious overtone. You're stereotyping someone, meaning you're not looking at them as an individual. You're just looking at them as a representative of some often pernicious.
This is well before all the studies of stereotypes were done.
Right. Well, all that he means is that you cannot possibly, in a complicated modern society that is fast moving, get to know every person on an individual level or every community. And so you have these things that you turn to, these categories, these shorthands. So stereotype is one of those strains that really comes out
Can
of
we
here.
guess the second one?
What is it?
Propaganda.
You're close.
Oh.
I would say the manufacture of consent.
Well, there you go.
Which is
Okay.
propaganda,
Okay.
but
Well,
it's his phrase that
His phrase
becomes
is-
picked up by basically every media scholar from this moment on. And it's about the ways that you make people think that they are buying into whatever it is. It's a product, it's a political system, it's a war effort, whatever it might be.
And that way of putting it is so of that moment, right? Because it's propaganda is what it is, but manufacture going on at that moment and consent, this moment when all kinds of fundamental things about democracy and citizenship are being sort of, debated. The fact, I hadn't thought of it that way, but manufacture of consent like makes perfect sense in that moment.
In a society underneath that is dividing more and more and more and more. But propaganda does become a term. You're right. His term is manufacture of consent. Propaganda is all over the culture at that point, particularly among black leaders and black artists. They're always in this period arguing about whether art and writing and culture should be just for beauty or for a political purpose. And that becomes an enduring problem in all kinds of culture.
But if you
cultural
believe
products.
in democracy, and if you believe, because of that public opinion matters, you're going to be thinking about what ultimately ends up being propaganda, right? If you're a politician, you're going to be thinking about that. If you're a corporation producing something and people want to buy it, it's. I don't want to say like they necessarily go hand in hand, but you can see how it's so tinged. There's so much baggage attached to the word propaganda, but you can also see how it makes perfect sense in this world that he's creating.
Well, Lippmann himself, I think, over the course of his life, becomes less and less sure that he does believe in democracy. And you can see in his fondness for expert opinion and the expert bureau some glimmers. He actually becomes much more conservative
Hamilton
on this question.
He gets a lot of glory in this book.
He does. That moment is a real reference point for Lippmann. But I wondered if we wanted to jump to Franklin Roosevelt, who is a very, very interesting character in terms of thinking about communication as a key part of the presidency. Talked about this a little bit in lecture today, but one of the things that I think really does make Roosevelt distinctive in his moment is first his willingness to embrace some of the new communications technologies that are coming in that Lippmann can only glimpse in the early 20s. Radio, most notably, it's
quite
just
there,
but it's not a mass medium yet.
10 years later, it is.
10 years later, it's everywhere. Right. Everyone has a radio. And Franklin Roosevelt is really the first president who says, this is a form that's good, and I can use this to shape public opinion.
Which gets at both ends of it, right? On the one hand, it's I'm thinking about the public, I'm shaping public opinion, I am, the citizens matter. You raise this in lecture, right? American citizens have a right to know. And on the other hand, it's about shaping and controlling and manufacturing consent, right? So you can see both parts of the equation, but you can also see how in the absence of that kind of thing before, even just looking at one of the images you had up of just him at a desk with all of the microphones in front of him, the power of being able to do that, of thinking to do that, and then doing that and thinking about being an American at that time and having the president directly talking to you in that way in your living room, right? The power of that it must have felt like is it's almost can't be captured in a photo. But that's what struck me listening to you during your lecture today.
The radio in every home, virtually.
And his understanding that so there's direct messaging, right? He wants people to know what he thinks and he wants to get this information out. But one of his big insights, even as a candidate in 1932, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. One of the ringing declarations of the early New Deal is a psychological analysis, right? Sure. That is about confidence and about connection and about emotion and hope. And so he, from the very moment that he's in office, he is trying to shift that equation through these forms of communication too. The thing that I admire, I guess two things that I mentioned this in lecture, admire about Roosevelt as a leader on this communications front are, one, that he understood something which I honestly think generations of politicians since have really forgotten, which is that the work of government is not legible to people unless you explain it to them, and you explain it over and over and over again in ways that they can understand in terminology, right? You don't just pass your law and think, it'll be great and everyone will experience it. People need narratives, they need language,
it's their job to do that.
Correct.
Some are better at it than others.
Right. Well, that's going to be true, but some don't even acknowledge that
this is part of the job.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, and the other thing that he was great at, or his administration, and he was not just this one-way transfer of information, but getting the information transfer back the other way. So thousands and thousands of people start writing letters into the White House, right? I had a graduate student, did you know Allison Green?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So Allison Green, graduate student who was here maybe 15 years ago, was doing a project on the New Deal, and she came across this amazing collection of letters. She wanted to write about religion and the New Deal and how the collapse of authority and economy changed how people thought about their churches, which couldn't feed them or take care of them anymore. And she came across this collection of letters that clergy people at the Roosevelt administration's behest had written in, and the Roosevelt administration just puts out a call and says, ministers of America, tell us how your people are feeling and what your concerns are and how we can bring, spiritual faith and rebuild America. And they just wrote in hundreds and hundreds of them. So it's a great historical archive, but it's also a sign of this back and forth flow. And he did this with parades. He did this with all sorts of other mechanisms.
I'm one of those people who grew up in a home where Franklin Roosevelt was.
Oh, David's going to tell us some old time stories,
old timey.
David.
Well, my mother thought Franklin Roosevelt was the son of God. I mean, she never stopped talking about the fireside chats, how they'd gather around the upright radio.
Well, exactly.
Literally.
There's a power to that, which
emotive power, but also in hard times. These are brutally hard times. This guy was finding a way to make you believe in the future.
And considered it important enough to do. In doing it, he was saying that he saw the importance of the people he was talking to.
Yeah, Roosevelt may not have been the intellectual, as many people said, but he did have that temperament, to use the famous Holmes quote that you use so well. He was a communicator, the great communicator. And if you were a young girl, as my mother was, and then a young woman, you didn't know any other president for the first 20 years of your life because he runs four times for president.
He did defy George Washington. We had Theodore Roosevelt, who I talked about on Tuesday.
Whom I'd like to go back to.
Yeah, he would be great to go back to. And he has such a funny political story because he's just this incredibly energetic, outsized figure. He becomes president when McKinley is assassinated, and he's young at that point, right? He's in his late 30s, early 40s.
Bully pulpit idea.
And he gets reelected in 1904 and then has his, but you can just feel the struggle in 1908 when he's saying, okay, George Washington stepped down and I want to be thought of as this great man. And so, all right, I'm going to step down, but then he can't stick with it, right? And it's one of these kind of charming things about Theodore Roosevelt that he comes rushing back into politics.
Could we get you to talk about the 1912 election?
Yeah.
I mean, it is a classic, four-way election. First Southern-born president since the Civil War is going to come out of this, but it is a pivotal. They're all progressives in one kind, and that was part of your argument about progressives. There are many kinds of progressives. 4 people and parties are running in this election, including TR, who comes back with his own new party. Tell us a little bit more on that election, what it meant, what a pivot it is in American history.
1912 is one of these great dramatic elections where everyone agrees that it's unpredictable and that the stakes are really, really high.
And no one's going to get a real majority.
Right. Exactly. It's a little bit, I thought about 1860, right? Yeah. The moment when...
Which was also 4-way.
Abraham Lincoln, it's a 4-way election.
And is it 1824 or 28?
24 is 4-way.
24 is 4-way too.
Yeah.
But in 1860, part of what happens is that the party that really has the majority can't hold it together, right? They can't hold themselves together. Yeah. And so you got the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats, and that allows this other figure to kind of make an end run and come in without a majority, but with an electoral college majority. And you see something like that in 1912. So the big story of 1912 is that Theodore Roosevelt re-enters the race at the head of the Progressive Party ticket because he doesn't like William Howard Taft. He thinks he's too slow-moving, too conservative. But William Howard Taft is the Republican candidate. And so the Republican Party just flies apart in that moment. Now it kind of comes back together in the 20s. But that is the big story of that election. And Theodore Roosevelt doesn't come in and say, I have some better ideas. He comes in and says, Armageddon is coming and we have to engage here. And he thinks that he's going to be able to do that. Meanwhile, Eugene Debs is running on the socialist ticket, does better than any socialist has done before since, though, we have some new socialism percolating up this week. in New York. And then finally, there is Woodrow Wilson, who is a progressive, but a Democrat. And the fact that he gets elected with something like 40% of the vote, but again, with an electoral college majority, is a sign of something changing in the Democratic Party. He's the first Southern president since the Civil War, even though he's been the president of Princeton and the governor of New Jersey.
Which was somewhat of a Southern college.
It was. Well, he made it. He made it a Southern college too, right? In all sorts of ways you might imagine. So that's what really ends up mattering, is that this figure of Woodrow Wilson and the Democratic Party and the South all get a chance.
But we don't only do elections in this course, although we love doing elections, don't we? We do. Why not? But there's so many social forces here. There are settlement houses being created in cities now. There's mass immigration. Ethnicity is being redefined every day in every way. The NAACP has become a force. It was founded in 1909, but it's becoming a force in the teens and then particularly in the 1920s. All kinds of social divisions are resurfacing in America. Let's talk a little more about that, too, because these forces are – technology is changing America seemingly overnight. So are many other forces. But at the time of this great war abroad and in its wake, there are huge forces happening within society. Let's go there for a moment. Whether it's about race or it's about women, and women are going to get the vote here, finally.
Immigration.
Well, immigration is going to get cut off after the war. But all of these on-the-ground social forces are also determining, in some ways, the politics.
Right. A lot of the ideas that are driving the politics are not coming from, a bunch of politicians sitting in a room or even a bunch of advisors or eggheads like Walter Lippmann.
And certainly not Warren Harding.
Right. They're definitely not coming from Warren Harding. Although, actually, I find Warren Harding more interesting than most people give him credit for.
I told you a factoid about Warren Harding.
That's right.
So my friend, historian.
You have factoids on Warren Harding, and you're soft on Warren Harding.
Well, my factoid, I'm offering it because you didn't know this.
I know. A lot that I don't know.
Nobody knows this.
I don't know anything.
My friend, historian Richard Bernstein, wrote a book, Founding Fathers Reconsidered, and in the book, he acknowledges that Warren Harding came up with the phrase "founding fathers."
Oh, I didn't know that.
Which is really interesting. How late in the game.
Now everyone out in our podcast world knows
I believe that Warren Harding also came up with "America First," didn't he?
Oh my God.
That I don't know.
No.
Yeah, I mean it's
much more interesting.
It's one of the slogans of his campaign.
We can't avoid elections. You see what I mean? We just can't seem to do it.
Warren Harding is also more interesting on race than many people give him credit for. But we'll just leave that as an aside.
Warren Harding. That's
Go read about Warren Harding.
Back to all these social forces.
Mass mobilizations become very much part of the story, first of the progressive era and then especially the New Deal. And I think one of the things that's really striking to me about the progressive era in particular, and it's just baked into the name, is no matter where you're coming into these issues of labor and capital, of women's rights, of temperance, of moral reform,
Prohibition.
of race or prohibition or immigration, there is this sense in that society that progress is a thing you can make happen. That's what progressive means. That's what a lot of these visions are about, that by thinking about things, by applying the tools, by being reasonable, by mobilizing, there's going to be this better future out there. And you see it, of course,
you can study it and make a better future.
You can study it and make it better future.
But I have a question for you, and I mentioned this earlier because the progressive era and the New Deal era, in one way or another, the citizen is at the heart of that, right? It's all about, for the progressives, it's using the state to have an impact on citizens. For the New Deal, it's sort of coming out with legislation, as you said in your lecture today, that becomes meaningful when the citizens take it and bring it to light.
It's about saving citizens.
Exactly. But so how would you, between the Tuesday lecture and the Thursday lecture, how does the idea of being a citizen change, or does it? would you say?
That's a great question. I would say in the progressive era, there is a preoccupation with what they called good government, right? And so a lot of the campaigns of the progressive era are these kind of campaigns of purification. So maybe
and city beautiful movements, right?
Right.
And parks.
Right. So if you're thinking about racial purification, right?
Well,
if you're thinking about
right.
drinking, kind of moral and personal purification. And then in the mechanisms of government, you're seeing that too. So there's a lot of concern with corruption and corrupting forces. There's a lot of attempts at reforming the mechanisms of government, the direct election of senators, et cetera, to get these corrupting forces, mainly big money in lots of cases, out of the system so that citizens can participate and it can be responsive. So those are those kind of purifying impulses, I think, are very much a part of the citizen story of the progressive era, whereas the New Deal is much less moralistic. There it has some moralizing qualities to it, but it is much less moralistic. It's much less concerned with purification, and it's much more about a kind of pragmatic organizing citizens into interest groups that can be embodied in institutions. And so your citizenship becomes not just like, am I voting or not, but what does my economic citizenship look like? That's a huge question of the New Deal. And the vision that is centered around the labor politics of the era is about the idea that your economic security and your economic participation is directly tied to your democratic citizenship. I mentioned this term industrial democracy, which is so popular.
Which is that's a give and take way of understanding citizen. The first one, not so much, the progressive era, but what you're talking about is a kind of give and take of, government does certain things, the people are supposed to take it and respond. One could say that, that's a kind of democracy that actually at its heart is democratic.
And I would say that the New Deal is very much about trying to find the institutional forms, labor being the most notable, through which that sort of back and forth can happen. How are you going to have that exchange such that the people on high are communicating their ideas down to the citizens? The citizens are taking those ideas, reformulating them, expressing them in some way, and that is traveling then back up.
Could we make one other, before we let you leave progressivism, could we make one other comparison here? It's a big generalization, but that's what we do in this course. I mean, in the progressive era, they're trying to tame things, these beasts, cities, huge factories that are, they're dangerous for workers. And you got the beginnings of workmen's compensation because people are getting injured and killed in factories. Cities become dangerous places. They need electrification. They need sewage systems. The cities are big and beast-like. They need order. So progressivism it's reform for sure, and it's sometimes pretty radical reform. But they're actually trying to tame something that capitalism has created. Whereas later, when you get to the Depression, I mean, the bottom has fallen out. They're trying to save capitalism. I mean, this is one of the old arguments, isn't it, about the New Deal? Was it really trying to create a socialist America or just trying to save capitalism? And at least the way I was taught, it's mostly the latter. Roosevelt was no socialist. Well, it depends on whether you asked Republicans in 1936 that. But there's so much about America that is greatly changing overnight. Nothing more than the cities, industrialization, and this kind of massive growth that no one quite has a handle on. Cities don't have proper sewage systems yet, and so on and so on. So if we're to make some link between these two eras, so important, these two periods, isn't there a continuity in the sense that what the progressives are trying to do is continued in the New Deal, but for a different purpose? I mean, one is trying to tame industrialization, but now they're just trying to save a capitalist economy by the 1930s.
With the public with an active public
Yeah.
at the heart of it in a different way than if you're trying to tame something, right? Because now part of that dynamic in the New Deal era is we're going to do this and then they're going to do this in response. And again, it's not so much taming. It's, I don't even want to say structuring. What is it? Creating the right kind of platform for?
And some of that is based around changing ideas of how the economy works and then changing economic realities. So the part of the analysis of the New Deal years is that what has caused the Great Depression, or the problem that needs to be solved, is this problem of mass production and mass consumption. And you saw glimmers of that before the 1920s, but that's what the 1920s are all about. These cycles of mass industrial production, automobiles, et cetera, and then the idea that if that's going to work, you need people to be able to buy those. And so that being a consumer citizen becomes one of the kind of buzz phrases of the 1920s, such that when the bottom falls out and that whole process collapses, it's not only an understanding of what democracy is going to be like, but an understanding that actually literally your economy is only going to work, right? This is basic Keynesian ideas.
John Maynard Keynes, you didn't name him in lecture.
I did not
today,
name him in
but
lecture.
You just did now.
Right.
Who was he and why was he important?
So he is the most influential economist of this era. He's a British economist, and he has this basic idea, first of all, that these cycles of consumption and production are what are going to make a modern economy work. And secondly, that the government has a big role to play in that. And so a lot of the politics of the New Deal are loosely organized around this idea that you have to have economically prosperous citizens, that too much inequality is going to be a danger not only to your democracy, but to your economy. And so it's organized around kind of trying to create this new kind of economic citizen that will not only be engaged politically, but will be him or herself an engine of
Although
economic
you know what that
prosperity.
takes us back to a little bit? You won't be surprised.
Will
What
it be
year
Hamilton?
are you going back to?
It will be
thank
Hamilton.
goodness.
Well, because he is, in his own way, saying that what I'm going to do is do things so that, like, let's make coins smaller in amount so that Americans will get used to using coins. Let's encourage manufacturing because that'll bring all kinds of people into, like, the cycle. You know, well, of course I thought about him because that's what I do.
That's all she ever
That's all I ever
thinks
think about.
about.
But you had a quote at some point, and I'm not going to remember which one. You had two that I literally like, oh, interesting quote. Hamilton said at one point, Americans are at heart an enterprising people.
That was Calvin Coolidge
That
said
was
the
it.
same thing.
That was
Business
precisely
of
it.
America.
He says
Business.
they are an enterprising people and that we should find ways to build into that. Hamilton was a hero of the progressive era for all of the reasons that you suggested. And Hamilton's reputation with the fall of the stock market died flaming death, right? Because suddenly he's like the guy, money, economy, business, society. But the thing that I want to mention, because it's a thread throughout this whole course, and I'm sure it'll come up again, gets us back to Lippmann, gets us back to public opinion. And that is the fact that the country was founded on the idea that unlike a monarchy, in this country, public opinion mattered. And in my period, they didn't know who the public really was necessarily. They didn't know how to get their opinion, but they talked all the time about public opinion and that in a monarchy, you don't have to think about it. But in a democratic republic, you do. And again, it made me think of this Hamilton moment, which in a way, no one at the time took it seriously because it sounded insane, but it's along the lines of what we're talking about today. At one point, in a really cynical way, in 1802, after they lost that big election of 1800, he says, you know what we got to do? Got to find a way to create these societies that are going to get people to join them and center them on things Americans really care about. And he says, the Democratic Republicans get all excited about liberty in France. We need to create something called Christian constitutional societies because if we can get their love of
If
Christianity,
you only had the song
linked
and
up
Armored Christian Soldiers, he might have
close.
accomplished
If we
it.
could get their
Well-
love of the Christianity connected to the Constitution, then we can sway public opinion. So, and everyone thought he was bonkers and no one paid attention to it. But the idea has been percolating in American history all
But
along.
here's the thing, and I will do it in a way as to feed you another question, Bev. Americans picked that up in the 19th century, and they began to call it harmony of interest, political economists. Then we get this thing called the Republican Party, which advances free labor ideology, a deeply held set of beliefs, that the path to mobility is for the free farmer and the worker.
Worth fighting over.
Absolutely worth fighting over, and keep the Slavocracy and oligarchies away. But that free labor idea, which attracted millions and led to this faith in mobility, as long as you could get slavery out of the way, that's running amok, if not practically dying by the Gilded Age. It's pretty hard to keep making that argument about free labor ideology in the midst of all these incredible strikes in the 1870s, 1880s, and then by the 1890s, a terrible depression. They didn't know it, but a big-time rehearsal for the Great Depression 30 years later. But by the time you get to the Great Depression, faith in a man's ability to feed his family by just going to work, it is collapsed. You mentioned today 25% average unemployment in the country by 34. Whatever, I think it was 34. 32. And when Roosevelt takes office. But in pockets of the country, even higher. Bread lines, food lines, Hoovervilles, those camp cities, homelessness. Free labor ideology is dead now. Unless you might have been in a union that could somehow hold jobs together and so forth. The New Deal becomes a way of creating something called faith and hope through legislation. I thought you made a powerful point. Government, exactly. That's Keynesian. But it's saying government can probably save you. Maybe. But government is the engine of social change. Government is the engine of protection, security, insurance. And out of it comes Social Security, which we fight about still every day. The Wagner Act, which is the right to collective bargaining for unions, and on and on and on. So big ideas in American history have been tried over and over, and they have won, and then they've lost.
Well, that's the thing, right? And that's what
and
this
they
kind
crash
of course.
in history.
That's what this kind of course. So we were talking earlier.
Yeah, we wouldn't be having this conversation if this wasn't a broad course.
We were talking earlier about, I didn't get to cover this, and you were saying, well, I didn't get to cover this, and that's the downside of that,
right.
This kind of course. But the positive side is that precisely what you just mentioned. We're seeing all of these patterns and ideas that are brought forward and then bang up against something else and crash, and then they come back in another form and bang up against something and crash.
One of those that really is striking to me, both in Lippmann and then in the culture more broadly, is this tension around American individualism, right? The big theme of de Tocqueville. It's been the theme of a lot of writers that we've seen. And
you can make it if you work.
In the 1920s, Herbert Hoover, who becomes president, actually writes a book called American Individualism. And it is this proud statement that this is the essence of America.
This is America.
Liberal individualism, free enterprise,
and
doing
you
it on
notice
your
his
own.
party never gave up on that.
Well, they got their comeuppance.
They did.
For a moment. And actually,
By the New Deal coalition.
a lot of the wrestling of the New Deal is about this tension between the individual and the collective. Right? And the idea of the collective, of collective action, of mass action becomes really central to the politics of this era in a way that I think we hadn't really seen before, right? You have mobilizations, the abolitionists, or, some of the political and social activity of the progressive era. But this idea that in a mass society with these giant corporations and a growing federal government, that ordinary citizens are going to have this kind of mass politics to collective politics is all about the collapse of these older narratives at a moment when it's evident to everyone you can't figure this out as an individual.
Which gets down to one of the big questions about democracy itself, right? Is democracy the freedom for individuals to do what they want to do, or is it a way to think about the collective good? Right? We still have that argument. And again, that's a long-standing argument that...
And we have that argument about how people vote. Do they vote for their individual interest?
Well,
we hope they vote for something a little higher?
What do
but this leads me to my
parties
question
stand for
you.
Yeah.
Before we leave it, for our students out there and for everybody, how bad was the Great Depression? I mean, how do we...
It was great.
It was really great. Yeah, when they call
it could have been
war
called the
great,
bad depression.
Look out. When they call it depression, great. But seriously, how can we understand just how bad the Depression was?
Well, in some sense, I don't know that we can. One of the statistically, the stock market starts to fall in October of 1929. Right. And it loses 90% of its value. And in fact,
that's almost hard to believe.
The stock market does not get back to its 1929 levels until the 1950s. So it is deep and it is long. Whereas you look at what would be our most recent analog, which would be the financial crisis of 2008, 9, 10. And that lasted, in terms of the dip in the numbers, nothing like this. And then if you look at what's happened since, right, it's gone up and up and up and up and up. So a dramatically different experience. And the Great Depression was not just one crisis. It wasn't just the stock market crash, right? It was this unemployment crisis. It was an environmental crisis. It was a homelessness and housing crisis. It was all of these things coming together at once, in addition to all the things that are going on the world stage. And so I think for everyone, even if you were someone who managed to hold on to your job or didn't end up impoverished, there just wasn't any way to think that this was about virtuous people or non-virtuous people, hard work or not. It was a dramatic demonstration that all of these things are linked together, and that's what it means to live in this society.
It introduced that precedent, right? Because there were financial panics throughout all of American history, right? Every couple of years in my time period, there are panics. But this
and then every 20 years.
Kind of thing introduces that sort of precedent of disaster, right? That a different understanding of society and finance in the United States that you can't conceive of until it hits you in the face like that, right? It's tied partly to like American exceptionalism, that it's always in one way or another going to be kind of okay, and it's bad for a little while, and then it comes back. And there's a moment where it was like, okay, now we're going to have to really restock and rethink and come up with a different way of understanding how we're traveling along as a nation.
Well, in that sense, the Depression was therefore also an opportunity. And that becomes this thing called the New Deal Coalition, which is not easy to sum up in one sentence. But on the positive side, the New Deal Coalition does manage to come up with something called FDIC, which is, by the way, a sticker on every bank in the United States. The next time you go to a bank.
It says if your bank fails, at least some of your money is insured by the federal government.
Some of your money is insured. Social Security is old age insurance that had never existed before. We borrowed that from Europe. They'd been doing it. But then a host of other kinds of legislation that begins to establish a social safety net.
At the federal level.
At the federal level, right. And states will be haphazardly trying to do it too over time. But then also the New Deal gets into cultural affairs. It gets into art. It gets into trying to save the lives of artists. It gets into electrification. It gets into building dams, to create electricity. I mean, it becomes, it doesn't solve everything. And God knows, it took World War II to solve the employment problem. But it begins to do things that a modern economy and an industrial economy had to eventually try to do, but it does it under dire circumstances.
Well, there's a real romance in our moment in certain sectors of kind of democratic and liberal
There's
politics.
a lot of romance about the 30s.
Right. Oh, and lots of people have their narratives, but particularly about this, right? That this was a government that acted and that did things fast, right? That did the TVA. It takes forever to like build a teeny little bridge now, but the whole TVA is built, right, in a very short period of time. And so I do think
Tennessee Valley Authority.
Valley Authority. I do think this narrative about a government that is acting and that is building, right? This is coming back around to our own political language in the moment.
But and also, as you just touched on, right? Not only that, but it is fostering the arts in a way, to allow writers and artists to practice their craft, right?
Sure.
And some of what they're asked to do is, national images or national stories or national narratives, but still, it's an artist-centric way. It's doing what
Post
we're
office
just...
murals came out.
Well, I was going to say, it surrounds us.
Hundreds
We don't
and
even...
hundreds of them.
A lot of Americans don't realize the degree to which in their everyday life still everything is shaped by that. And that is very much also, you said the romance of it, and I thought that's where you were going to go, is that the arts were being fostered in an arts-friendly way, that they even thought of doing that.
Right. They made greats. The WEPA sent people out to do guides to every state. What is your state like? Who's there? What are its big landmarks? And they're actually still incredibly fun to read. And of course, even in the midst of all of this, there was a lot of political fighting and a lot of political opposition. So I want to assure everyone that we are going to get to all the people who hated the New Deal, thought this was a disaster and a corruption of everything that the United States stood for.
We need a little smiley moment before we get back to the hate.
Well, true.
And welcoming the hate.
But let's not forget, you showed us the maps. Franklin Roosevelt won 3 landslides. Well, 2 for sure. Third one, not quite as much. But man, that's a blue map.
They're big landslides, and he has these big congressional majorities, and that's why you're able to do this.
And I encourage folks, like if you're listening to this, watching us, you're watching the lectures, find the maps that you showed of what happened between red and blue states.
Well, yeah, that's reversed.
If you haven't yet watched the lecture, watch the lecture, because that's just even from a modern standpoint, kind of mind-blowing.
And actually, we've been promising, and we will, to provide our images, our slides, and so on. You're lucky there. You didn't have as many.
That's not lucky.
I know. Well, okay, it's not lucky.
I do appreciate modern communications, technology, and artistry, which really makes teaching about the 20th century a very different experience.
But David and I have been sitting in the audience next to each other going,
"Oh, we should have
has
an image
photographs."
like that." Yeah. Well, but that aside, this is an era now. The whole 20th century is a period of not only vast change, but just every kind of communication changes every decade. Pretty soon we're going to have airplanes flying around and computers and God knows what.
And if I can say one thing about those political maps, a piece that is incredibly important to this era that we haven't talked about, I talked about it a little bit in lecture, is what happens to the party coalitions, which go through a radical shift during this period, from this era of Republican dominance to one of the Democratic dominance. But the Democratic coalition, this famous thing called the New Deal coalition, which really does dominate American politics for about 30, 40 years, is such a strange coalition, like all political coalitions are. And what Franklin Roosevelt produced was a party that included the Solid South, so the white South, but also the newly enfranchised black voters of the North. Right. It included elites, but then it also included industrial workers.
Labor, unions.
Labor as really the centralizing force. And so for this moment in the 30s into the 40s, arguably a little bit beyond that, all of those groups see a common interest in New Deal liberalism of a sort, but certainly in the Democratic Party. But one of the stories that we're going to follow in the next couple of weeks is the ways that that coalition starts to fly apart.
But it comes together because of a crisis.
Right.
That's the upside.
And mutual interest to at least enough degree to make a coalition.
Which are fueled by the sense of crisis. And as an upside, there's a creative component of crisis.
Never let a crisis go to waste.
Never let a crisis go to waste.
There's a way in which that can be a moment in which you can create change and improvement.
One little measure of the point you just made. African Americans, to the extent they could vote, and they did in the North and in large numbers in cities, still voted for Republicans, the party of Lincoln, until the 30s.
1936.
36. And the Chicago Defender, one of the widest subscription black newspapers, runs a headline in 1936 that said, Abraham Lincoln is not running in this election, which is their way of saying, vote for FDR. You know? And from that point on, blacks in this country have started to vote increasingly Democratic and have ever since. That's one of those huge shifts in American politics.
Can I ask a question? Because I know we're running out of time.
Yeah.
And this will be a segue.
We're having too much fun.
We are having
Don't
too
look
much
at that
fun.
clock.
A segue question. So where do we head next week?
Oh.
So we are going to continue our race through the 20th century, having
Hold your
covered
hat.
40 years at this point. So next week we're turning to World War II and to the birth of the national security state. So Tuesday we're going to talk about the war itself and why the United States fought. That might seem obvious, but it did not seem obvious at the time how that war was fought, where that war was fought. So we're going to look at World War II, and then we're going to look at the late 40s and early 50s and the rise of anti-communism as sort of the glue of American mid-century politics and the birth of what we call the security state, the permanent military establishment, the intelligence agencies, all of these things which seem so normal to us today, but actually were invented in a very particular moment.
And the music is only going to get better. The hits are just going to keep on coming.
So folks,
before long, we're going to have blues and jazz and rock and roll.
So folks,
I think.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
We are beginning to have perhaps too much fun with this, but that's all right. Thank you all for listening to this newest edition of the podcast for America at 215. America 250, a history. Thank you.